Man, indicators are great. I can't wait to share my love of them with the warning. This video will contain opinions which you may shockingly find disagreeable. If you have any children old enough to have opinions but too young to have valid thoughts, please secure them in their room listening to Baby Shark on loop. Today's topic is on indicators, which will absolutely not be controversial at all because I'm sure everyone's going to agree with me. First, I'm going to talk about what the standard indicators are, what they mean, and how to use them in your levels. There are all sorts of indicators in Mario Maker, but I'm going to focus on the three most common classes of indicators for this video. You have coins, arrow signs, and track indicators. Let's go over each individually. Coins are the most basic and universal indicator. Coins, by definition, guide Mario to collect them. Coins can be used to signal jumps, wall jumps, drops, and landing on positions that might be out of view from where Mario initiates his jump. Coins in general are extremely specific as to where you have to be and what you have to do in order to collect them. The next major class of indicators are track indicators, and the most universal ones are shown here, either throw indicators or a Z indicator, where a throw indicator is a box which has one side missing, which directs Mario to throw in whichever direction is open. In the case of a down throw indicator, based on context, on the ground this can mean to wear a helmet or otherwise press down, or more frequently, to drop an item. And a Z indicator tells Mario to spin. There are some other very common indicators, like abridged throw indicators for shell levels, or twirl indicators, but the most universally understood ones are the ones shown here. While coin indicators are very specific as to Mario's position, track indicators are slightly more vague. Generally, throw indicators need to be placed such that Mario will be throwing an item when he's in the middle of the box. Normally, Z indicators are just placed near the site where Mario actually has to jump. The next major class of indicators are arrow signs, which generally give Mario guidance on which direction to go when it's not immediately obvious. Unlike track indicators and coin indicators, which give very specific directions to Mario, arrow signs are normally extremely vague. They only tell Mario which direction he should generally head in. Of course, there are a couple of situations where arrow signs can have a very specific meaning, specifically to indicate ground pounds, to indicate ground pound cancels, to indicate twirl jumps or long jumps in 3D World. One common delusion is that you can direct Mario to run by putting a lot of arrow signs in a certain direction. And I don't care how many arrow signs you put, you're still just pointing to the right, bro. Another major class of indicators are so-called custom indicators. These are signs that have no inherent meaning of directing Mario to do something outside of your own level, but you define it in your own level. This is a boomerang level, and there is no standard indicator that tells Mario to throw a boomerang. So here I have a custom indicator of two dotted line blocks. Those two dotted line blocks do not have an inherent meaning to them. However, I start out the level with a setup where it's obvious that Mario needs to throw his boomerang in order to progress. And this sign is right there. This defines this symbol so that whenever Mario sees this symbol, it has an indication that he needs to throw a boomerang. And so that way, when he sees the symbol reinforced later in the level, he can move on and understand what has to happen. When trying to indicate something that already has a normal standard indicator for it, please do not make up new indicators. In terms of indication, arrow signs are one of the most misused course parts, where sometimes people try to use arrow signs to indicate specific actions, such as jumps or to throw. I know that some people think track indicators look ugly. However, defining custom indicators as arrow signs normally defeats the purpose of an indicator, because for a custom indicator like an arrow sign, it could mean various things. Look right, go right, thwomp going right. And so the arrow sign's meaning depends on the context. And if the point is that I have to look around the level, to read the level, to understand what I have to do, that defeats the purpose of using an indicator in the first place. Whereas a track indicator has the same meaning no matter what context you find it in, and will always give that specific direction. There are all sorts of other types of indicators that I'm not going to go over, like P-block indicators and dotted line block indicators, blah blah, like that's not the point of this video. The point is to talk about how to properly use indicators. Everyone in Mario Maker can agree that there's only one indicator that's really the very best one, and the answer to that is, the best indicator is no indicator. Let me explain. So look at this setup. What does it look like? Oh, it's a standard bounce level, okay? Bouncy, bouncy, oh, oops. You do have to put a Z indicator here because of the way you put the setup. And without a Z indicator, this setup is actually not fair because there's no way to know that you actually needed to spin on this first mole. So without a Z indicator, you're basically leading the player to die. The issue here is not that you have a Z indicator and indicator's bad, bro, where's my Z? Do we need the indicator, or did we just make the level in such a way that it lets you do the wrong thing? The issue here is that it's not intuitive from the level's design. Just by looking at the setup on the first screen, you have no clue that you actually have to spin jump without a Z indicator. Rather than having a Z indicator, we could have, for example, a shellmet there, which would have a very similar effect where Mario does have to spin jump on it, but now it's reasonable to expect that Mario would have to figure out that, well, if I just normally jump here, I'm gonna die. It's much more inherently obvious that you do have to do a spin jump in order to progress in the level. Here's another example of an unintuitive but well-indicated setup where here you got to do a giant blind Z drop onto a thwomp. So the question is, why does Mario need all these indicators? He needs these indicators because he cannot see far enough into the level to understand what he has to do. If instead we took the same obstacle and lowered the platform, then from here we can actually see both where the thwomp is, that there is a thwomp, and exactly how to land on it. And by making this edit, all these indicators are completely unnecessary, as Mario can figure out from the level structure exactly what has to happen. Let's say that I have a Kaizo level where I need to do a controlled jump across this gap in order for, let's say, the setup to not jank up. So I have to do this, right? And you've indicated it correctly that I do need to do this controlled jump. But the level doesn't stop me from ignoring the indicator and doing it the other way. If this happens, you can't really blame the player for disregarding the indicators because they saw an intuitive way to move forward in the level that you didn't block them from doing. In this situation, if you want a controlled jump, it's better to force it with a very obvious spike ceiling. Now it's intuitive to the player what they have to do to cross this gap and that they are not allowed to jump higher. In general, shaping your level to stop the player from doing things that are incorrect is a better approach than trying to indicate the correct thing to do.
I guess Loup is just telling us to take all the indicators out of our levels, so everyone loves indicators.
I want you to understand that indicators do have a time and a place. I'm not telling you to never have indicators. I'm not saying to just rip out indicators from your levels, all right? If you have a setup that needs indication in order to be fair, then you need to indicate it. What I want to be clear here is that your very first option needs to be make your level as intuitive as possible to not require indicators in the first place. And then, after you've stupid-proofed your level as much as possible, then add any indicators that you may need to plug up deficiencies. Avo's analogy for this is that it's like a door that you have to push open. An indicator would be like writing push door on the sign, but the more organic way to do that is to put a giant push bar so that it's obvious when you look at the door that you have to push it open. My argument to you is that you should have more of the obvious do this as opposed to having to explicitly tell the player to do that. In general, you want your level to require as few indicators as possible, and only really put indicators where they are required. Indicators have several downsides, which makes them kind of like a low-key deal with the devil. And so here I'll outline some of the major downsides for using an indicator. One is that indicators frequently add visual clutter that can make it harder for the player to actually read and appreciate the rest of the level and the rest of the setup that you've actually put. Instead of looking at an on-off switch that you have to throw a shell at, you're just reading the indicator that tells you to throw the shell. The last main reason why you'd want to reduce the number of indicators your level requires is because they're usually a symptom of unintuitive level design, of a level that lets you do it wrong or one where it's not obvious what you have to do. Because if it were obvious what you had to do, you wouldn't need an indicator in the first place. So there are a few main reasons why you'd want to use an indicator and when they are extremely valuable to your level. Indicators excel at reducing the number of options that a player needs to consider when going through a level. This is very helpful when you have a more complex level where you actually do have several options, especially in something like a Link Kaizo, where Link has a very wide toolkit accessible to him, and if you want to go fast with Link, you need to provide some guidance to reduce the number of degrees of freedom. The second main reason you want to use an indicator is to allow the player to figure out what to do in a setup faster. Looking at the setup, it should be obvious the player is responsible for figuring out that you have to Z-jump off of this thwomp because how else are you supposed to progress? Like, you can clearly see what has to happen in the level. So, in general, this setup does not require a Z indicator. However, if we are in fast auto-scroll and the player has to go very fast, then there may not be enough time to react to that being a thwomp that you need to spin jump off of in this level. This would be a setup where a Z indicator would be completely warranted. This is a very common issue in hold right speedruns, where Mario is going so fast that you don't have a whole lot of time to react to different obstacles on the screen. In this sort of situation, indicators help by giving Mario more time to react, to get ready to do the thing that he needs to do. For a similar reason, shell tricks are almost always indicated because the player will need time to get ready their momentum in advance in preparation for doing whatever shell trick. Indicators are also useful for teaching tricks that the player may not already be familiar with. For example, many people just don't know that you can actually spin jump off of a wall. And you can also spin jump with items in your hand in Loup&Snoop, as well as spin jumping off of claws and spin jumping off of note blocks. These are all tricks that, especially if your level is fast-paced and you don't really have the time to teach the player at your leisure, you will definitely want to use an indicator to teach the player, by the way you can do that. Indicators in general can help make ends meet when the screen scroll is not on your side. In this example, there's not really a good way for Mario to see that on-off switch before he has to throw. The first obvious solution is to restructure the level so that the camera already has the target in sight so that Mario doesn't have to do this blind. But if the level structure does not allow, then it's completely fine to put an up throw indicator in order to extend the information that Mario actually does need to up throw that shell so that the on-off switch isn't just kind of like a blind face check. In general, it's better to err on the side of over-indicating and risk your level becoming a little bit messier to read than to be accidentally under-indicating and have that lead to an unfair death on the player's side. In general, Loup&Snoop and 3D World have a lot more options when it comes to movement in terms of having wall jumps, and so it may be a little bit more confusing to read a level in terms of exactly where Mario has to go, which walls he has to access, which platforms should he be jumping from, etc. And so in general, point indicators in these styles will be much more useful. Indicators can also be useful when you have crisscrossing paths in a level, as sometimes it can be hard to understand exactly what has to happen without them. However, when having crisscrossing paths, you have to be careful that indicators for one path are not read for the other. Here, if I indicate every single maneuver, and we've gotten the player to the point where they are going to blindly trust everything, they may misunderstand this coin indicator as we're just hoping, we're just going to trust the level maker that he's going to have something on here for us to land on. And that can be very confusing. For this situation, I tried to indicate the bare minimum to get the player to be more responsible for reading the level and trying to figure out what has to happen here. The optimal way to indicate this setup is by only putting a single Z indicator to clear up whether or not the player should normal jump or spin jump on this Mecha Koopa, because that is not obvious. So from here, now the player is responsible for figuring out, okay, after I spin jumped on Mecha Koopa, where's my next platform? Where am I going to go? And they're not going to rely on blind faith, which will be wrong if you put the indicator in a certain spot. For crisscrossing paths, it's generally helpful to keep in mind that coins get erased when Mario collects them, so in the return path, they won't be visible. Furthermore, arrow signs and track indicators can be hidden behind assets, such as bill blasters, so that you can either hide them when they're not necessary or reveal them when they are. I'll give some notes on how to use indicators as effectively as possible, because if you're going to use an indicator, you want to get as much bang for your buck. The most important rule for indicators is to be consistent with how you indicate in a level. If you have a level where every single throw is indicated except for one, then you could be sending the player mixed signals, where you're telling the player, no matter how obvious it looks like to throw that shell, I want you to hold onto it, just trust me. For this reason, when you're using indication, you either want to go with very light indication so the player understands that they are responsible for what happens, or going all the way. Remember though that with indicators, you can always go overboard and risk your level becoming just messy, and here we have a nauseating coin trail. This is a garbage speedrun level. In general, having indicators that are poorly placed or redundant with other indicators in your level can generally make it a lot harder to read and understand, which undercuts the actual value of an indicator. Furthermore, when you place an indicator, make sure that you really do need to follow the indicator. When a player sees indicators that they can ignore, it reduces their trust in the other indicators in the level, which causes them to read the rest of your indicators as mere suggestions as opposed to directions. The first one or two indicators that you don't need to obey gets the player to stop actually listening to your indicators, as you can see in this glorious hot mess of a level, which by the way is an approved Team Shell level. Sometimes there's a lot of cool setups that you can only really do with the help of indicators. I want to end by saying that indicators are great. They allow you to make all sorts of amazing setups that allow Mario to do cool tricks that aren't really comprehensible in a level without them. Or allow Mario to run through at blazing speeds, doing all sorts of maneuvers. However, do not use indicators as a crutch. Indicators are not a replacement for trying to make your level as intuitive as possible without them. To quote Iron Man, if you're nothing without the indicators, then you shouldn't have them. You need to learn how to make a level that does not require indicators first, before you up your game to more complex setups. Otherwise, you'll just be making incomprehensible setups. If you like this content, feel free to like and subscribe. If you disagreed with me, make sure to smash that like button to let me know and write a comment down below explaining why. As always, it's been great. I'll see you around, guys. Later.